Yo, what's good, Time Clan? It is your boy KingTitanX here. You know, the narcissist himself. And basically, what we have today is, what if Naofumi was a legendary dragon hero? So, of course, things are going to work very, very different in this timeline. You see, Naofumi would be rather different. His physiology and everything would have been completely different from his original self. And here, Naofumi, he would have been born to the dragon tribe, and where he would find himself having scales, golden eyes, fangs, claws, and wings as well. You see, there was one issue with Naofumi though. Despite having all of these features, despite having wings, and to be more specific, he had a disability of sorts. Unlike the rest of his race, he wasn't able to fly. His wings were non-functional even when he used his battle aura in order to amplify his physical abilities. Naofumi would have been mocked at for this. He would have been labeled as a failure of the sort by his people. He would be forced to work menial jobs that no one else would take due to his inability to fly as well. Flight was something especially desired in his society after all, or practically needed. So for somebody who wasn't able to fly, it was embarrassing. People didn't believe that Naofumi would amount to anything with him being unable to fly and all, but he did plan on proving them wrong somehow. By the time Naofumi reached his race's equivalent of 20 years old, he had managed to establish some form of strength for himself that his race could somewhat respect. He found that he always fell behind though, since those who could fly, well, they would usually be hunting dragons and the like, for crying out loud. Naofumi, on the other hand, he was just carrying boulders. Naturally, it made sense that those who could fly, they would be the ones to have the advantage here. Naofumi wished every day that he had the ability to fly, just so that he could keep up with the rest of his race, but he was just dealt a bad hand in this life. But maybe, just maybe, it would be different in the next life, or maybe he would be able to finally awaken the ability to fly, although it was a long shot. Naofumi, he would witness something disastrous happen one day. A giant beam of energy, it began to consume his area. It seemed like it was consuming everything, to be honest. Many people were trying to run. Naofumi would also try to run in this case. But there was one issue. The beam was closely approaching him and he wasn't fast enough. He wasn't as fast as other people. Sure, he considered himself to be a good runner, considering how he practically needed to be able to run in these sort of circumstances where many others in his race, they could fly. So running was the only other option that Naofumi really had. But even now, it seemed as if all of that speed built up over the years, it was pretty useless against this beam of energy, because it would actually end up consuming him as well. Naofumi, at this moment, he would have thought that this was the end, that he was dead. But instead, he would find himself on the floor the very next moment. He would feel himself and be surprised. He was alive, or at least seemingly so. He he would pick himself up from off the floor and look around. He was confused as to where he was. The last thing that Naofumi remembered was, well, getting enveloped in that expanding beam of light. Naofumi, he would notice 3 others while he was looking around that were in the same room as him. But there was one thing off about them, well, besides their appearance anyways. There was the fact that they were holding weapons. A spear, a sword, and a bow. Naofumi would find that he himself didn't necessarily have a weapon of note. Rather, he just had a gem embedded into his chest. The 3 other guys in the room, they would just stare at Naofumi. Once Naofumi noticed that they were staring at him, he would question why. They would apologize though, mentioning how they had just never seen anything like Naofumi before. He had scales, golden eyes, white hair, well, not white hair, black hair. Well, the hair was probably the only normal part about Naofumi. Everything else just screamed a different species. Naofumi was about to ask what they meant by that. What exactly did they mean by never seen anything like him before? But you'll be interrupted by a priest coming into the room, mentioning how they were the great heroes. And well, the king apparently wanted to have an audience with the 4 of them. They would be escorted over to the king's throne room, where they would be introduced to King Oldcray. After an explanation of there apparently being waves in this world, which the heroes, well, they needed to protect the people of Melormike against, the heroes, they would question why they should help. Naofumi would be the only one out of the whole group to remain silent though. The king would settle everyone down by explaining how each of the heroes would actually receive the greatest of treasures if they managed to defeat the waves. The king had no problem giving them the greatest of riches after all. They would deserve it after defeating the waves. Just being able to protect the people of Melormike, the king would be eternally indebted to the heroes. The heroes, I like the sound of it, and he would go on to actually ask about their names and get to know each other on a one-to-one basis, you could say. The other 3, they would introduce themselves, but the king would interrupt Naofumi when he was about to introduce himself. He would stare at Naofumi in confusion. He wondered where the shield hero was, and if this guy was summoned in his place. Well, then again, if this guy was summoned in the shield hero's place, that honestly wouldn't be too bad in the king's opinion. It meant that they no longer had to worry about the devil of the shield arriving in this place. This holy grounds, you could say. The king just had a vendetta against the shield hero, and this guy coming in, well, he didn't hate this guy necessarily, but he would stare at Naofumi with contempt. He would question why a monster like Naofumi was here. Naofumi would be confused as to what the king meant. He would explain, or at least try to explain, that he was not a monster, but rather he was of the dragon tribe. The king refused to hear a word from Naofumi though. He refused to listen to Naofumi, and he would just command for his guards to escort Naofumi out of their premises. Ren, Itsuki, and Motoyasu. They would try to argue with the king though for his treatment of Naofumi. Old Cray, he would just silence all of them by explaining that Naofumi, he wasn't necessarily a real hero. He was nothing more than a monster that deserved to be treated as such. He would fit in more with the demi-humans of anything, even if there were probably still a couple of differences. The heroes disapproved of the king's philosophy, but he would shut all of them up by offering them an extra 500 silver to their wages if they just kept quiet about this whole situation. The heroes hearing this would be rather enticed and quickly shut their mouths. Naofumi, he would actually be thrown out of the castle with only the clothes on his back to his name. He would pick himself up off the floor. It seemed like he was finding himself on the floor quite a bit today. And he would leave to explore this new land. After all, he had never heard of a place such as Melvermike, so it seemed like he was really teleported away from his homeland. He would encounter some balloon monsters on the way, but using his claws, he would easily pop them. A status bar would actually appear though, showing Naofumi his progression though. Currently, he was at level 1, and that by destroying these balloon monsters, he would gain XP. Naofumi, he saw this status bar as a form of foreign object. He would try to touch it, but it would just phase through, or at least his hand would phase through the screen. Naofumi would be very confused. He came from a very primitive land, you could say, so something like this was completely new to Naofumi, but he would try to get adjusted to it. He also figured that maybe he could become even stronger here through this leveling system of sorts than he was back in his old world. Maybe he could become faster, stronger, who knows, maybe he could even fly in this world. Naofumi, he would just destroy several more balloon monsters and make it up to around level 3 for these guys alone. Eventually his progression was beginning to slow down, so he decided to go hunting for more monsters. These silly balloon monsters, they were getting rather boring to deal with, so he just continued to explore, finding more monsters. He didn't have any money to his name, so he had nothing else to do but hunt for his food. Some of the scraps he would realize though that he could sell in order to make a quick buck. Most merchants, they would be hesitant at first, considering Naofumi's appearance, but they would be lying if they were to ever say that he didn't bring in valuable items. In their opinion, it would be a waste to refuse the service offer just his appearance alone. Naofumi, he would eventually be able to rack up a good couple hundred silvers, although he had yet to use any. The reason being, he didn't really need to, and that he was still getting used to the currency of this world. He was simply observing for a while, but he felt like he was starting to get a bit of understanding, but there was still a couple of things that he was kind of confused about, or maybe he was just overcomplicating it. He wasn't exactly sure just yet. Naofumi managed to make it up to level 7 on his own by the time a strange man would approach him. This strange man would appear to Naofumi in the middle of the night, and he would offer Naofumi a proposal of a lifetime. This proposal being, that he could probably have something to help him with his travels. He was a hero after all, or so we heard, and the hero needed party members. Naofumi, he would deny it at first, but the man would ease Naofumi into his mindset. He would explain to Naofumi that he could only get so far on his own. Naofumi was strong, yeah, but well, no man was a one-man army. You see, having somebody else fight alongside Naofumi would allow for Naofumi to continue to level up as well, probably at an even faster rate since there was going to be a second set of hands helping him fight off the monsters. Naofumi would follow the slave trader to his base of operations after hearing the slave trader's reasoning. Naofumi would be offered a variety of slaves, only to find that, well, most of them were pretty much too expensive. They were out of his price range for him to even consider purchasing. So he would decide to settle for the cheapest one out of all of them, this being a sick demi-human girl. The slave trader, he would try to insist on Naofumi reconsidering, maybe look at some well, better slaves that he had at hand, but Naofumi would just shoo the slave trader away, explaining that he was going to go with this slave and this slave only. Naofumi had begun to gain an understanding for the currency in this world, and by this moment he realized that he was most likely just overthinking it for a while now. It was honestly pretty similar to his own world the more he observed it. So he would decide to buy the girl off of the slave trader, but he would stop the man from adding a slave mark onto the girl. Now for me, he would explain his reasoning being that he had no purpose for there to be a slave mark on the girl since he wanted her as a teammate. Nothing more, nothing less. The slave trader, he would accept this reasoning from Naofumi, and the two would just be on their way from there on. Naofumi would buy the little girl a small knife from a weapon shop owner by the name of Erhard. He would also buy her some medicine after another successful hunt and being able to sell the corpses for a reasonable amount. He noticed that when it came on to Raftalia, she was sick from the day he had met her. And, well, he just couldn't afford for her to be sick after all. He needed this girl to be at 100% health if she were to ever become an effective party member. Naofumi would have Raftalia join him more often on his hunting expeditions once she began to get better. She would be a bit fearful at first, considering how, when it came on to some of these monsters, they bled, but Naofumi, he would force the girl to get over this mindset really fast. Naofumi would even give Raftalia an ultimatum at one point. If she wanted food for the day, well, she would have to hunt and kill a monster on her own. Raftalia would settle for a rabbit-like monster and stamp through them. Blood would gush out to the creature, but Naofumi, he would applaud her for her efforts, setting up a fire to actually cook the rabbit monster. They would go on to kill a couple more monsters that were similar to the rabbit monster that they had just faced, and they would sell parts that they didn't eat afterwards. Naofumi, by the time he had reached level 15, managed to unlock something he had missed for a while now. This being his battle aura. It felt unusual not being able to use it after being accustomed to, well, using it in his fights for so long now, in his old world. In this new world, it had put several restrictions on him, even limiting his strength. But Naofumi figured that through this leveling system, he could regain all of that strength and more. So Naofumi would continue to explore the land, racking up quite a bit of money alongside Raftalia, but the two would end up finding themselves exploring a cave one day. It had been affected from the wave, and where there were apparently some dangerous creatures, but there were also really valuable ores there. some very valuable ores in that cavern. So Naofumi and Raftalia, they would decide to explore, willing to take their chances here. They would end up encountering a two-headed black dog on the way though, and they were trying to attack the duo. Raftalia, she would freak out seeing the monster because, well, it gave her PTSD, or well, it triggered her PTSD, I should say. It reminded her of the monster that killed her parents, although that dog was more of a Cerberus and where it had 3 heads. This dog just looked very similar to the one that killed her parents, and Raftalia, she would begin to freak out. Naofumi would be very confused and kind of concerned since he had noticed that she had become a lot more confident these past couple of days, but all of a sudden it just seemed as if she had gone backwards in development for some reason. Naofumi, he would charge his battle aura around his fists, using his Fang technique in order to break through the defense of the monster. He would greatly weaken the monster on his own, but he would force Raftalia back onto her feet afterwards. He would explain that she needed to kill this beast right here, right now. It seemed that the monster had some effect on her mental state, so he figured that the best way for her to get over it though would be through killing this monster herself. Raftalia, she would be a bit hesitant, but she would plunge her knife into the monster's heart. This would be enough to put them down for good. Naofumi and Raftalia would go up in levels after that kill on Raftalia's part afterwards. To celebrate Raftalia's victory, Naofumi would use the saved up money to buy the girl a new weapon from Erhard. He could afford to buy her fairly high quality weapons at this point, so he would settle on buying her twin swords. Erhard would mention something about the wave though, wishing the two good luck. Naofumi would decide to question how they could find out more about the waves when the next wave would happen, and Erhard would be surprised that Naofumi was even asking him this question. He figured that Naofumi would have known already, but he would explain that they could use the dragon hourglass in order to tell how much time they had before the next wave. Naofumi would head over to the dragon's hourglass after getting a couple of directions from Erhard, and Naofumi would find himself meeting up with the other heroes as well. Interestingly enough, none of the heroes actually had much to really talk about though. Motoyasu, well, he would try to hit on Raftalia though, noticing her more developed body at this point in time. She was considered to be a grown adult by demi-human standards. Raftalia, she would be annoyed with Motoyasu's flirtatious advances at her, so she would simply grab one of her swords and place it close to the blonde's throat, telling him not to play lover boy with her. Motoyasu, he would sweat nervously. Ren and Itsuki, they wouldn't even pay much attention to Motoyasu. Instead, they were paying more attention to Naofumi, and where they would actually check his level, it was rather high. They wanted to ask him about how he was able to level up so fast, especially with only one member on his party, but they would be teleported over to where the wave was at that moment. While the other heroes, they went to immediately deal with the boss. Naofumi would decide to take Raftalia over to one of the nearby villages, Loot Village, in order to fight off the monsters there. He figured that the other heroes had the boss handled already, so he found that there would be no purpose in him joining. 3 heroes fighting off a monster was already good enough. Having a 4th hero face just one monster, well, that was pretty much overkill. He figured that it would be better to focus on establishing more connections, and by doing this, well, he would be protecting Loot Village. That would be the very first village he would really decide to work on building connections with. Now for me, he would use his claw technique in order to slice through the monsters. Raftalia, she would cut down her own fair share of monsters as well. The knights on the field, they weren't all that great of a help though, considering how they were about to burn down their village rather than protect it. Naofumi had to call them out though for this, even forced to use some magic from his other world in order to get the point across. He would use voice magic in order to disrupt the balance of the soldiers. It would paralyze them temporarily, just so they could stop with their attacks before they burnt the village to the ground. Now for me, he would actually manage to protect Loot Village until the very end of the wave to celebrate their victory against the last wave though. King Oldcray would have an after party be formed with all of the heroes invited as well. Naofumi would attend simply because of Raftalia's request though. He didn't really want to be there after his first interaction with the king after all, but he figured that if Raftalia wanted to do it, then why not? He didn't mind all that much. He could hear some people whispering about him as well though. It was rather annoying, but he decided to keep a cool head here. This was all for Raftalia after all. She had been a really good partner throughout this journey in this world, and she deserved to have some fun. It was the least he could give her after basically forcing her to become his teammate. He was in a pretty good mood until Motoyasu decided to walk up to Naofumi and slap him with his glove. He reprimanded Naofumi for having a slave in his party. Naofumi would be quick to correct him though, explaining that Raftalia, well, you see, she wasn't a slave. She didn't even have the slave mic, so she could leave him at any point in time. It's just that she chose not to. Motoyasu, he wouldn't believe Naofumi though, believing that he was probably using an alternative method to trap the poor girl into working for him after Raftalia showed that she didn't have a slave mic on her. He refused to believe the possibility that Mine was lying to him. Naofumi was getting annoyed, well, even more annoyed than before. His anger would rise when he saw the guards grab and put a muzzle on Raftalia as well. The king would try to force Naofumi to duel Motoyasu in order to win back Raftalia. But Naofumi, he would refuse this time around. He wasn't having any of it. He would backhand Motoyasu and charge at the guards. He would use his superior physical strength to rip their hands off of Raftalia, and he would use his voice magic to paralyze them as well. Once again, Motoyasu, he would try to charge at Naofumi with his spear in hand, but Naofumi, he would swiftly grab the spear, yanking it out of Motoyasu's hands before headbutting the blonde and breathing fire in his face before hitting him with his own spear and kicking Motoyasu in the gut before beating him with his own spear once again. The other heroes were powerless against Naofumi. They knew better than to go up against Naofumi at this point. They were honestly quite fearful of Naofumi at this point. Naofumi, he would just take his leave with Raftalia afterwards, leaving behind the beaten squadron of knights and the wounded pride of Motoyasu. Motoyasu, he wanted revenge though. He wasn't about to just let Naofumi humiliate him like this. Naofumi may have ruled the night. Naofumi may have won this match, although through pretty dirty ways, you could say, at least in Motoyasu's point of view, but he was going to get his revenge one way or another. He just had to figure out a good time and how to get stronger before he were to face Naofumi, because he had to admit he did make a pretty foolish move trying to go up against somebody who was around 10 levels ahead of him already. Old Cray was furious. He honestly didn't know what he was thinking. He knew that it wasn't smart to involve himself with that beast when he reappeared in his home, his kingdom. He honestly wanted to just get rid of him right then and there. The bow and sword hero, though, they were the ones to actually convince him to let this mongrel stay. As a result, guess what happened? This monster decided to harm his soldiers. And the spear hero, he managed to even burn their face for crying out loud. Not even their best healing magic could completely heal this guy's face after that. After he literally gave him third-degree burns, he still had a scar from the fire to this day. Not even their best healing magic. How? It didn't make sense. It never made sense to the king. How was this guy powerful enough to make a fool out of the spear hero? The fact he was so easily able to defeat him was unnerving. It didn't sit well with him at all. Old Cray would make sure that this guy, Naofumi, paid. Well, he would make sure that this mongrel paid. He refused to address him by his real name. When it came on to Naofumi, though, he would honestly just be traversing the region with Raphtalia. When it came on to Naofumi and Raphtalia, they were silent throughout the whole walk after that whole event in the banquet. Raphtalia would eventually decide to say something in order to end the awkward silence between the two of them. She would use this moment in order to thank Naofumi for rescuing her from the guards. Naofumi, though, he would look over to Raphtalia, and he would just sigh. He would tell her not to really mention it. Raphtalia would bring up how it might be good to visit the slave trader again to, well, get a new teammate, considering the amounts of money they managed to make up at this point. Naofumi would at first be against it. Raphtalia would bring up that the king was probably looking for them now. Well, after what Naofumi did, she wouldn't put it past the king to even have guards running up, well, not guards, but knights trying to search for Naofumi in order to capture him or whatever. And they would probably use numbers against Naofumi as well, considering how Naofumi had proven how strong and capable he was in a fight. But they weren't too sure about what would happen if it was a whole army against Naofumi. Although that may be a bit excessive, there was a chance that Naofumi may not be able to take down such an army, such a large amount of people. Naofumi, hearing Raphtalia's reasoning, he would honestly have to agree with her. She even mentioned the other heroes as well. Although he was able to take down one of the heroes rather easily, there was an issue of him actually facing all three at once. She wasn't too sure if he was that strong to handle all three of them at once. It was possible, but did Naofumi really want to test his luck in that area? Naofumi, once again, had to agree with Raphtalia. She was bringing up very valid points. Eventually, he would cave in once he realized that she did have quite a bit of points, you could say. There was really no way of predicting what the others could do after all. When it came on to Ren, Itsuki, and Motoyasu, they all had different ways of fighting, considering how they had different weapons, and Naofumi would have to adjust to each and every form of combat against these three. He doubted that he would be able to knock all three out at once. Well, maybe he couldn't. Maybe he couldn't just end the fight quickly, but when it came on to having a pretty long match against these three all at once, that wasn't what Naofumi would really want to test his luck on. He wouldn't want to bet that against anybody, to be honest. They were deciding to stop by the slave trader and they would look around before Naofumi just decided to buy a lottery egg. Nothing in the slave trader's market seemed all that appealing to him besides the egg. He heard that there was a chance of him being able to birth a dragon after all. It wasn't anything new to tame a dragon where Naofumi came from, but he always wanted to do one. He always wanted to tame a dragon himself. He had always had to see other people within his tribe take down and tame all these large dragon predators, but he had never experienced taming a dragon himself. Raftalia, she would bring up the whole issue of Naofumi raising a dragon though. Naofumi would basically hear Raftalia comparing the two, wondering what would happen in case Naofumi actually did end up, birthing a dragon. Did that technically mean that Naofumi was adopting a dragon? Were they like his race or something? Naofumi always claimed to be from the dragon tribe, but Raftalia, she wasn't exactly sure what that meant. Wasn't that like all forms of dragons were from his tribe and that they all came in varying sizes, or what? Naofumi would deny this though. He would simply explain that they just had a common ancestor. And nothing more, nothing less. They just evolved differently throughout the centuries. Just like how there are humans, demi-humans, and as an animal species. Are they connected in one form or way? Yes, but at the same time, that doesn't necessarily mean they're super identical. Basically what's happening is that Naofumi would explain that although he's from the dragon tribe, that doesn't necessarily mean that all sorts of dragons fit into his tribe. It's just that they have common ancestors, just like Raftalia has a connection to humans as well as other animals. They all share a common ancestor. That's the only similarity they really had. Along with maybe some features here and there. Naofumi would head over to Loot Village in order to see how it was holding up after the wave once they had retrieved or bought the lottery egg. Naofumi would be pleased to see that it was doing pretty well. It was the first time he wasn't given judgmental eyes or stares of any kind since he first came to this world. He appreciated that. While in Loot Village, he would witness the egg he was carrying hatch. It was revealed that it genuinely was a baby dragon that Naofumi managed to hatch. He was surprised to see that they hatched so quickly though. He was expecting to wait at least another month or so, but he wasn't complaining. Throughout the day, Naofumi would notice that his pet dragon, they were growing at a rather rapid rate while they were leveling up, while Naofumi and Raftalia, they were doing their usual hunting and killing of monsters, which would end up having them level up. Naofumi would be collecting some of the pelts, obviously, and sometimes cooking the animals as well, or the monsters. Eventually, he would see that his dragon, they managed to become large enough to ride on actually. They had grown thick red scales, horns, and their wings. They were rather large too. Motoyasu, he would show his scarred face into the village though, with mine and a couple soldiers soon after. He would declare himself as a new lord of this village apparently. The first thing that he planned to do though was add a heavy toll onto the village. Motoyasu did not know the value of money in this world at all. He just usually had his party members figure that out for him. Now for me, kind of figured that as well. He found that the price was rather ridiculous for such a poor village, and he would be forced to step in once again against Motoyasu. He saw how half of Motoyasu's face had still been charred from his attack that night. He immediately figured that this wasn't going to end well at all. He wouldn't be able to just convince Motoyasu to, at the very least, lower the toll to something more reasonable for the villagers. Motoyasu was most likely stubborn, probably bitter over that night, and if Naofumi tried to talk down to him in any way, for all Naofumi knew, well, Motoyasu may even try to raise the taxes that he would be putting onto the villagers. Naofumi would walk up to the front of the audience, and as soon as Motoyasu noticed Naofumi's face once again, he would begin to snarl, but he would quickly regain his composure. He would point a staff toward Naofumi and inform the guards to arrest him right here, right now. Naofumi, he would raise an eyebrow in confusion, but he would also notice that the guards, or the soldiers, they were cautiously gathering around Naofumi. Naofumi, he would simply flare up his battle aura, and this would make the guards fearful. They weren't necessarily able to see his aura, but they could feel it. He would paralyze the guards, and he would stare seriously at Motoyasu, the blonde. He would declare that Naofumi had become a criminal within Melonmike. The king had declared Naofumi to be a criminal, and that he even had a bounty now. Anyone who could bring the king Naofumi's head, they would be rewarded 100 gold pieces. Naofumi wouldn't be all that surprised, to be honest. He kind of figured that the king already did not like him, and that stunt he pulled the other night definitely didn't put him in any better standing with the king. Although he did find it to be a bit foolish that the king would try to straight up kill him. After all, he was a hero summoned to this world. Even if the king didn't want to acknowledge it, it was still true. And currently, he was probably the strongest one out of them all by a substantial amount at base. This was not including whenever he used his battle aura, which amplified his strength. A mysterious figure they would appear in the way though, in front of mine. They would hand her a piece of paper. When reading it, mine would crush it in her hands before telling Motoyasu that they should leave. Motoyasu, he would refuse though. He wanted to fight Naofumi and get his revenge for that humiliating defeat from last time. Mine would be annoyed at how stubborn Motoyasu was being today, but she would suggest that, well, Motoyasu race Naofumi. Why not? She was well aware already that Motoyasu, well, he obviously stood no chance against Naofumi in a straight up fight. But there was a chance he could win against Naofumi in a race. Motoyasu, he would accept the offer in hopes that he could regain some of his pride that way. Naofumi would also accept, and the two would mount their dragons. But despite Motoyasu's best efforts, Naofumi's dragon would continuously outpace him. She would try to tamper with the race in order for it to go in Motoyasu's favor, but Naofumi would witness the incantations attempted to be made and cancel them out using his disturbed magic. Mine would find herself incapable of using her magic in her right arm. She would try to get the soldiers up in order to help in her efforts against Naofumi. Although some were able to slow him down a bit, they weren't able to slow him down for very long. They were very minimal in the long run. And Naofumi, he would actually still end up winning the race. Naofumi would win, and Motoyasu, he would be frustrated beyond relief. Well, not relief, but belief. He was contemplating whether or not to stab Naofumi through the back
well, he wasn't paying attention, but the villagers, they would catch onto what Motoyasu was thinking, and they would immediately shoo him away, forcing him to leave the village. Once again, Motoyasu, he had been humiliated. He would tighten his grip on his spear as he left. The village elder would give Naofumi a carriage as a reward for winning the race against Motoyasu, though, alongside a commercial bill. This would basically allow Naofumi to be able to go to all sorts of villages or even kingdoms without needing much of a reason. Naofumi will be confused at first until they explain the purpose of the commercial bill. When he came onto the carriage, he figured that it would just make things a bit easier for travel. He could probably store up a couple of things within the carriage as well. Before Naofumi left, he supposed he would need to also name his pet dragon, in which he would decide to name them very uncreatively Drago. Yeah, you heard me right. Raphtalia, she would just facepalm hearing the name and suggest Rhaegal instead. Naofumi liked it. Naofumi also noticed that Rhaegal had become rather large as well. They were, well, even larger than Motoyasu's dragon at this point. They were large enough for both Naofumi and Raphtalia to technically ride on at this point. Heck, maybe they could even fly on the dragon if they really wanted. That's how big they were getting. Naofumi's party would leave and begin their new journeys from there on. Naofumi remembered hearing Motoyasu mention how he was apparently a wanted criminal during their travels, and he would be pondering this. He would be questioning why this was the case. Well, not why, but more so what else he could learn. He wanted to find out more about his new criminal record, you could say. He would hear some rumors regarding the other heroes from time to time, but he would also have some run-ins with some bandits who were hoping to collect Naofumi's bounty. They always failed. I'm gonna keep it a buck with y'all. He would use these opportunities to collect some information on the Kingville and the allegations that he had against Naofumi. Naofumi would laugh hearing that the king was actually getting aggravated with how he wasn't able to get his hands on Naofumi despite the bounty that he had given him. He also heard some of the allegations and he had exaggerated the events that transpired, or however that word is. I'm gonna use transpired in his kingdom that night, in his castle. Some of the events were completely made up, like Naofumi attempting to kill the other three heroes, which would leave Melvermark in serious danger or whatever, but Naofumi already knew that all of these were just lies that the king made up in order to make sense of his bounty. He had even begun to raise it, apparently, but the only ones who could hold a candle to Naofumi at this point were the other three heroes, which really wasn't saying much for the three, considering how easily Naofumi managed to defeat Motoyasu. But during one of his trips, Naofumi would actually save an accessory dealer from getting robbed by bandits. Naofumi would get into some dialogue with this merchant, mentioning how annoying these guys could be, and the merchant, out of his appreciation for Naofumi saving him, would actually decide to teach Raphtalia magic. He would also teach Naofumi about marketing skills and how to craft items as well. He wanted to teach Naofumi magic, but Naofumi, it seemed as if he already knew rather advanced skills in terms of magic. Skills that he hadn't even seen before, in all honesty. Before Naofumi and the merchant when deciding to part ways. The merchant would actually recommend a potential business opportunity in a region by the name of Lerno Village. Naofumi, Raftalia, and Regal, they would head over to Lerno Village, only to see that it was infested with vines and plant monsters. Naofumi would find out that this was Monteyasu's doing, in which he had apparently had the bright idea of gifting the people here a miracle seed. That seed was cursed. It was meant to help with the people's famine, but it grew out of control when Moteyasu left. So that's a W in Moteyasu's book. The people would commission Naofumi to exterminate the source of their torment. Naofumi would bring down most of the plant monsters, while Raftalia, she would just cut through others. Regal, they would claw through their fair share of enemies as well until they reached the source of it all. Naofumi would destroy it, causing for the rest of the creatures to immediately die as well. Naofumi would take some of the seeds though and rework them in a more viable form of crop production, something that wouldn't grow out of control. Naofumi would take some of their crops as a form of payment, the villagers obviously, figuring that they'd be pretty good when mixing it with their next hunt. You know, adding some fruits and vegetables to like some pig, you know, like get some bell peppers, some thyme. You know what I'm talking about. Like maybe have some radish, tomato. Add that to your monster meat, and you get a whole new luxury. We talking Gordon Ramsay kind of luxury, man. But Naofumi's party, they would also decide to head over to Merso Village. Merso Village was their next business venture, in which they would find out about the terrible condition that it actually was currently in. The sword hero, Ren, was in the village a while ago and managed to slay a dragon. But there was one issue. This issue being that he did not get rid of the dragon's corpse afterwards. It's almost as if he forgot, or that he was still thinking that this was one of those virtual reality MMO games or whatever these guys maybe called it. Honestly, Naofumi wasn't completely sure, but he was just making some things on the spot. This was common knowledge, in Naofumi's opinion though, to get rid of the dragon's corpse afterwards. You always get rid of the dragon's corpse, no matter how big or small it was. He had to dispose of a good amount of dragon corpses back in his old world, so this wasn't anything new for Naofumi. So to find out that these guys, they were literally letting these animals rot, letting these dragons rot. Why? He didn't understand why. What was going through their head at that moment? It made absolutely no sense to Naofumi, but he figured that he would have to clean up this guy's dirty work. Naofumi and his party, they would just head up to get rid of the corpse, only to find that it was undead. Naofumi feared that this would happen. This was one of the main reasons why they needed to always get rid of these dragon corpses back home, because there were apparently some people who knew necromancy, for crying out loud, or like some form of death magic. They could literally manipulate the dead, and being able to manipulate a dragon's corpse, that was a no-go. Naofumi would just be forced to use his battle aura in order to defend himself against the zombie dragon's attacks. The dragon, they would try to claw at Naofumi, only to find that they weren't able to break through his defenses at all. Naofumi, he would charge forward, using his own claw technique in order to slice the dragon's arm off. Raftalia, she would come right in, following right behind Naofumi, riding Regal with her swords out. Raftalia would take to the sky, jumping off of Regal to aim for the undead dragon's head. The monster was about to shoot poisonous gas out of its mouth, but when it came onto Naofumi, he would make sure that that wasn't going to happen. He would punch them in the chest. Their chest would immediately collapse. Well, not collapse, but cave in at this moment. Raftalia, she would jab her swords into the zombie dragon's head, which would force it open. The zombie attempted to get back up, but Naofumi would rip open their chest, ripping out their core. The light in the monster's eyes would disappear right after. Naofumi would observe the object, realizing the potential power that it held. He would decide to add some of it to his armor after he dealt with this idiot king that was named Altgrave. On the way back, they would meet up with a girl by the name of Melty. She was surrounded by Felolials, but they would all seem to flee the scene right when Naofumi and his dragon came in. Naofumi would be confused until Raftalia mentioned that when it came on to Felolials and dragons, they had a natural disdain for each other. Naofumi found this to be rather interesting. He figured that while him being like part dragon as well, or being from the dragon tribe, even if Regal wasn't here, they would probably still not want to be in close proximity of Naofumi. Melty would get Naofumi's attention though by requesting a favor from him, this being to escort her home to Belremark's capital. Naofumi would be hesitant though, not wanting to deal with fighting off all of the guards or having to interact with the other heroes. They would probably be very annoying and a waste of energy. He was a criminal after all, and he still needed to speak with the beloved king or whatever about this nonsense. Melty would convince Naofumi to escort her though by mentioning how she was actually royalty. She had heard about what her father did and had been meaning to speak with him about it, hopefully being able to get the bounty removed. Naofumi was a hero after all, even if he wasn't the traditional shield hero or even looked the part like the other heroes in terms of having a human appearance. Naofumi had a close enough resemblance to a human though. It's just that he mainly had scales and golden eyes. The golden eyes weren't much of an issue, but it was the scales. He had a human-like appearance though, but it wasn't completely human. At the same time, Raftalia, she would urge Naofumi to believe Melty though. When the group made it to Castle Town after Raftalia successfully managed to convince Naofumi to bring Melty along, they would immediately notice flyers with his face on it. Naofumi would notice that each had a varying price on his head. He would get strange looks as he walked into town with Melty. Motoyasu would have been nearby as well, and he would notice Naofumi. He would grip his spear in anger before charging at Naofumi. He would see this and just use his battle aura in order to block the attack. Motoyasu would be confused as to why he wasn't able to get past a certain proximity. It was as if there was a wall between him and Naofumi. Naofumi though, he would use this moment in order to question what Motoyasu was doing with a great amount of annoyance at this point. Motoyasu would call out Naofumi for being a no-good criminal that deserved to be treated accordingly. Melty would just step in though, bringing up her royal status to Motoyasu, forcing him to stand down. Melty and Naofumi would depart afterwards, with Melty wanting to get Naofumi's charges cleared. Naofumi wanted to upgrade his armor. He had hoped that the addition of this core would actually amplify his stats by a great amount. Naofumi Naofumi wouldn't be able to get any services from Erhard though. The reason being, well, the fact that it was bad for business due to Naofumi's current status in the capital. Him just conversing with Naofumi was risky. Naofumi would be disappointed, but he would understand where Erhard was coming from. Naofumi would also realize that his team, they were in dire need of a class upgrade. He doubted that he will be allowed to do that with how stubborn the king was being right now. They wouldn't even bother going to the Dragon Hourglass in Melromite, and they would just leave before the king decided to send a whole squadron of soldiers at Naofumi's party. They didn't want to get themselves involved that much with the king's affairs like that, or would be against the capital in such a way, or making the king out to be the good guy, even more than already. The king was basically antagonizing Naofumi, and the king was just trying to make it so that Naofumi would just play into his hands, but Naofumi was not going to allow that to happen. The group would make their way over to a northern territory that had been suffering from a famine for a while now. This time, though, it was Itsuki's fault, since he decided to overthrow a corrupt government. But the issue in this was that the people he had gathered to overthrow said government actually took over after Itsuki left. They would erase all of his efforts, and the people were in an even worse situation than they were before. Naofumi, he would just pull out a couple of seeds that he still had from the whole bioplant incident, and he would hand it to some of the villagers and homes after being able to help with their famine. Naofumi would leave the scene once again with Raphtalia and Rhaegal. Right before the wave, Naofumi would meet up with Ren and Itsuki, who would accuse him of having actually stolen their rewards from the Adventurers Guild. Naofumi, he would just glare at the two before stating that the two of them actually failed to do their jobs properly. He had to do the cleanup work. He would explain that they needed to understand that when it came onto this world, it wasn't some children's game. They were dealing with life or death, for crying out loud. Ren left the dragon's corpse to rot, which made the people of Merso village deathly ill. Itsuki, he decided to lead a revolution that only caused for a new, more corrupt government to arise. Do they not understand where they are going wrong here? Naofumi had to resolve both of these problems while these two, they were playing fairies and elves. The boys, they would be speechless hearing this. Everyone would be teleported over to the wave soon after, with the boys having to reflect on their decisions, or that's at least what Naofumi hoped. When it came on to Naofumi, he would just decide to handle Loot Village like he had once did in the last wave. After dealing with the monsters in that area, Naofumi would explore the region for a bit, killing other monsters along the way. Raphtalia should mention how it had been a while since the wave started, and Naofumi realized that Raphtalia, she was actually right. It had been like over an hour or so since the wave started. And usually the waves, they didn't last this long, or at least not the last wave that they had to deal with. The trio would search for the other heroes. Naofumi would actually use this opportunity in order to try flying on Rhaegal. Turns out that Rhaegal could genuinely fly. They could fly pretty well with both Naofumi and Raphtalia on his back. Naofumi would be pretty amazed to see Rhaegal flying like this. This was probably going to be the closest to flying that Naofumi was ever going to be able to reach. So he was pretty excited about this point. But his mood would immediately sour when he saw what was going on with the three heroes. Apparently the trio of heroes. They were actually bickering amongst each other, and they were apparently trying to figure out like where the boss was. Not necessarily trying to figure out, but more so using what sort of skills in order to figure out where the boss was. They were bickering about that. What should they use in order to find out where the boss was? And Naofumi was livid seeing this. Naofumi would just ask for Raftalia to deal with finding the boss, since the heroes were about to risk losing several lives in order to win a petty argument. The boss will be revealed as a Soul Eater, which Naofumi was just killed by bombarding it with battle aura infused punches and claws. Naofumi was expecting for the wave to dissipate, but it was still here for some reason. Naofumi would be confused until he was forced to dodge an attack from a new enemy. They were wielding Warfrans. They would introduce themselves as Glass as well. They were apparently here to kill the heroes. She would quickly overpower the other three heroes, and Naofumi would be the only one standing. He would be surprised, but he would get ready for a fight against this girl, Glass. Glass would immediately dash forward and towards Naofumi with a slashing attack ready, but Naofumi would just parry her attack. Naofumi would grab her arms and hold them down before headbutting Glass. She would be a bit dazed from the attack, but she wouldn't even be given the chance to find her footing once more. As Naofumi, he would just use his claw technique in order to slash across her chest before kneeing her in the face. Naofumi would just sucker punch her while being enhanced by his battle aura afterwards. Glass would realize at this moment how vicious of a fighter Naofumi was. He was on a whole other level compared to the rest of the heroes, and even her. She would try to outpace Naofumi though, attempting to get behind him. Right when she thought she had the upper hand though, Naofumi would just elbow her in the throat. Naofumi would turn around and grab her throat before pinning her down to the ground. Naofumi wouldn't waste any time now that he had her pinned to the ground. He would crush Glass's lungs before plunging his other arm through her chest, killing her. The wave would end afterwards. Naofumi was reconsidering his decision to kill this girl though. He probably could have gotten some more information out of her. Well, any information besides, oh, she was just here to kill the heroes. But she was clearly a threat that Naofumi had to deal with accordingly. For them to be able to take down the other three heroes so easily was concerning. The fact that the other three heroes weren't even able to take down the boss, not like he really even gave them a chance to even attempt to, with how ridiculous they were acting before, was also concerning. Raftalia, Regal, and the three other heroes, they would have witnessed how easily Naofumi was able to deal with Glass. And they had to admit, it was honestly quite scary how strong Naofumi was, while Naofumi was going through his own inner conflict on whether or not these heroes were really, well, hero material, with just how much stronger Naofumi was in comparison to the other three heroes. It made no sense for these guys to even really be here, besides maybe being sidekicks for Naofumi. And Naofumi's mind, he didn't really want that. Motoyasu, on the other hand, he wanted Naofumi's strength. He wanted that sort of strength for himself. It wasn't fair that when it came onto Naofumi, he could be so strong in comparison to everybody else. He didn't even have a weapon, for crying out loud. Motoyasu, who would clutch his spear incredibly tight. He was tense. He would kill for that sort of power that Naofumi had. Naofumi didn't even look his way either after the wave. He completely ignored him. It was as if he really considered him to just be that much below him that he wasn't even worth looking at. Naofumi, he would make sure that he regretted every single time he embarrassed Motoyasu. Motoyasu would make sure to become stronger, one way or another. Motoyasu would have no idea of what was breaking inside of his heart either. Naofumi, the next day, would have his presence requested by the king apparently. The guardians would explain that when it came on to the king, he decided to drop his challenges against Naofumi as well. Naofumi would decide to follow the guards though, wondering what gave the king a change of heart. Was it Melty? When he appeared before the king, he would demand to know how Naofumi became so strong. Naofumi would smirk hearing this before questioning why. Why would he be asking a beast such as himself something of that nature? After all, he was a no-good monster, not a hero, so why did it matter? The king would bring up how Naofumi was able to easily dispatch the boss and the strange being in that last wave that none of the other three heroes could handle. They needed the other three heroes to become stronger for any more success within the waves. Naofumi was obligated to tell him. Naofumi would laugh hearing this before letting things be straight. He would make this very clear to the king.
Naofumi wasn't obligated to tell the king anything. He would mention that wasn't the same mentality the king had when he decided to make Naofumi a criminal, putting a bounty on his head. The king was being backed into a corner. Naofumi would admit he had been willing to tell the other heroes how he became so strong, well, as strong as he is now. But the king was really making him reconsider. The actions that the other heroes had done had really made Naofumi reconsider telling the heroes how he had managed to become so strong, especially when it came on to Motoyasu. This guy has been on his back for a good while now. This guy has basically been trying to threaten him for some unknown reason. Motoyasu seemed to really have it out for him. But Naofumi would let the king know one more thing. He would actually be willing to tell the other heroes how he became as strong as he is now if Ultcray would give Naofumi his throne. Ultcray would be appalled that he would even consider that to be an option, consider even saying such a thing. If Naofumi refused to tell him, well, the king supposed he would just have to get that information out of Naofumi's party members, one way or another. Naofumi knew exactly what the king meant. He would stump forward with smoke leaking out of his mouth. The king would panic seeing this. Naofumi would use the king as an example of what happened when somebody, if anybody, were to ever threaten his party. The king's crown had been melted onto his skull. While Ultcray, he was crying bloody murder over the agony he was feeling at the moment. Naofumi, he would simply storm out to the castle. He figured that now would be a good time for his party to leave the area, a better time than never at this point. He didn't know what the king had in store for him next, especially with what he had just done to him, and he wasn't in the mood for finding out either. Rather, Naofumi would just hop on to Regal with Raftalia following suit. They figured that there was a chance of there being more places for them to get class upgrades, rather than it only being Mellomark. The group would soar into the sky, eventually deciding to take a break after a good couple of hours in the sky. When they landed, they would realize they were actually being followed, and it was by Melty. She looked angry. She would demand that Naofumi stop whatever he was planning on doing next. She wanted him to go back and apologize to her father for what he had just done to him. You don't literally... You do not melt a crown onto somebody's skull. That's so messed up in her opinion. He needed to also reverse that harm he had just done to her father. But Naofumi, to her shock, would refuse though.
he was coming off as a real jerk to her right about now. And this was very out of character for Naofumi, at least as far as Melty had been able to figure out so far. Naofumi would then explain his reasoning though, this being of course the fact that the king threatened his party. If she really wanted Naofumi and the king to have a good relationship, that idea, well, that flew out the window as soon as the king decided to say that sort of thing, to threaten his party. That was crossing the line in Naofumi's opinion. Melty, she would be speechless in the end. She didn't really know whether to believe Naofumi or not in this situation, but Naofumi, he didn't have much of a reason to lie. And it would make sense considering his actions towards the king. The king didn't really seem to like Naofumi all that much from the get-go, especially with how he kicked him out of his kingdom on day one. And then Naofumi also seemed to have bad blood with the king moving forward from there on. Especially when it came on to that whole situation with the king trying to confiscate Raftalia in a way. They would honestly have to really reconsider what they were hearing right now, whether to believe their father or whether to believe Naofumi. Melty was conflicted, but Naofumi would actually decide to do something rather drastic. He would immediately grab her and block an attack from one of her escorts. Melty, she would be surprised. Naofumi, he would actually call out the soldier for seemingly wanting to kill Melty. They would mention how they had orders though, and they would attempt to attack Naofumi while actually trying to get to Melty. But if they could kill both of them, that would be killing, well, two birds with one stone. Naofumi would simply grab the soldier. They would shock the soldier from this demonstration of strength until they ended up finding that their armor had been penetrated through as well by Naofumi's claw technique. Naofumi would breathe fire at the soldier, causing them to panic. The flames Naofumi was emitting right now, they were hot enough to melt the metal of their armor onto their skin. Regal and Raftalia would fight several other soldiers as well. Regal would swing his tail at some of the soldiers, sending many of them flying. Raftalia would knock out some of the other knights using the blunt side of her swords. Others she would find herself having to kill though, since they refused to stand down. There were quite a few who would honestly try to flee as well, but Naofumi, he would catch up to them in no time, forcing them to submit and tell him what was really going on. Naofumi would interrogate each of the soldiers or knights, whatever you want to call them, eventually discovering that mine, that's right, Melty's own sister, had put them up to this. Naofumi would be angered hearing this. Although he didn't necessarily have the greatest grasp on family, he knew what it was like to have comrades, and that was probably the closest he would ever have to a real family. But to even think about betraying your teammate in any form or fashion, well, that was just downright horrendous in Naofumi's opinion. Having a bond through blood especially, that was probably one of the most personal sort of connections anyone could have. And mine wanted to kill her own little sister. He never liked the girl. He never liked mine at all. He saw her as nothing but manipulative. Ever since the day they tried to take Raftalia away from him against her will, despite that he never thought that she would stoop to this level, to stoop so low. This was an all-time low for mine in Naofumi's book. Naofumi figured that the other heroes would probably be coming after him soon as well, so it would just be best to get back on track to find another area to do class upgrades. Naofumi would decide to bring Melty along with him now, since she was clearly at risk of being killed as well. Melty would mention that they could potentially go to Shield Freedom in order to get class upgrades. She figured it would be safer to, well, stick with Naofumi during these times. She was still pretty rattled after the betrayal of her own sister, naturally so, and Naofumi's party would have to wait for Regal to regain their stamina if they decided to fly high speed once again. For now, they would be riding on the dragon instead of flying. They would make a pretty good distance away from the other heroes, so they didn't have to really worry about them catching up for a good amount of time. Anytime soon, at the very least. They did get detoured though by one of the Queen's soldiers, or at least that's what Melty referred to them as. Apparently the Queen, well, she wanted to meet Naofumi's group, and she was in Silt currently. He would question whether he should or not at first until Melty, well, she actually confirmed that the Queen was more like her than she was mine and her father. Naofumi, he would honestly take Melty's word for it, since Melty had to get her more mature approach to life from somewhere, and he knew pretty well that, well, she did not get it from Altgrey, and mine certainly got a personality from the king, so it would make sense that Melty got her personality from her mother. Who knew? Maybe she even looked like her mother as well. It was hard to say since he had yet to meet this woman, but his curiosity would have been piqued at this moment. Naofumi's group would move in the opposite direction of Shield Freedom, and they would head to Silt now. They heard some extra footsteps and familiar voices in the background though. Naofumi would simply have Regal pick up the pace though. Melty would recommend they stay the night with one of her friends, a noble by the name of Van Richnod. He apparently close to her, so Naofumi, he would have no issue doing so. Naofumi would make a smoke screen in order to make sure that it was even harder for the heroes to keep track of where he was going. They would meet up with a noble, and they would be accepted with open arms. The only issue though was the fact that there was another noble who was allied with the three heroes' church around this area. They had a suspicion that Richnod, well, he was harboring a false hero. They would break in and actually attempt to kidnap Richnod, forcing them to tell him where the hero was so he could report them to the church. Melty would allow herself to be taken as well in order to protect Naofumi in this situation, but Raftalia, she would alert Naofumi her old master, and he would often treat demi-humans horribly, dehumanizing them. Naofumi immediately despised this guy with a passion. People that acted like they were better than others for being born a certain way just annoyed Naofumi to no end. It gave him flashbacks to how he was mocked in his old life, always called a failure. Naofumi and Raftalia, they would follow the noble and immediately apprehend the kidnapper. Raftalia would want to personally deal with idol Rabier, plunging her swords into his chest. They were by the window at this moment. The force from Raftalia's attack would actually shatter the window. Rabier would stumble out the window, falling down several stories. He was presumed dead, so Raftalia would focus her attention now on freeing the slaves that were most likely still there. She would rush over to the dungeon and free every single one of them that was there. Amongst the former slaves, there was one of her childhood friends, Keo. Raftalia, she was disappointed to see that her other childhood friend, Rafana, wasn't able to pull through in the end though. Naofumi would comfort the distraught Raftalia. She had gone through a great loss after all. He could tell. The little moment would be interrupted though. They would hear a pretty loud roar outside, and Naofumi and Raftalia, they would head outside to see just where it was coming from, only to find out that the noble, he hadn't properly died yet. Well, he was bleeding out, but he was not completely dead. Idol Rabier had apparently unleashed a monster that was once sealed by previous heroes. They weren't strong enough to kill off the monster properly. Naofumi would be lying if he said he wasn't intimidated in the slightest by the dragon-dinosaur hybrid. Naofumi and Raftalia, they would attempt to fight off the tyrant dragon Rex, but they would continuously overpower the duo. Naofumi's battle aura wasn't even enough to deal with a monster. Naofumi would be whacked over to the side of the forest, slamming his back against one of the trees. Naofumi would slump down, coughing up some blood. This was unusual. He didn't recall having bled like that since he came to this world. He thought back to the dragon core he wanted assimilated into his armor, and he would pull it out of his pouch. It was cracked. He hoped it was still usable though. He never tried this before, but he figured it would be worth a shot. So Naofumi would simply have the green gem embedded into his chest, consume the dragon core. Naofumi would experience a sudden increase of strength, energy, and speed doing so. The system was mentioning something about scanning the dragon's core. From this, not only were his stats improved upon, but he also unlocked a new ability. He could breathe poison. He would use this ability to weaken the tyrant dragon Rex and eventually gain ground against it. Naofumi, he would use voice magic in order to cause the monster to lose their balance and collapse their ground, paralyzed. Raftalia would pierce the dinosaur dragon's eyes, blinding it. They weren't sure how long the paralyzation would last for, so they figured it would just be best to make this quick. Naofumi would breathe fire, cooking the dragon Rex alive. It had been weakened severely, but it was still alive somehow. The monster was attempting to pick itself up, but a new figure, they would arrive just at this moment onto the scene, crushing their enemy's head. Naofumi would be surprised though. He'd be even more surprised when seeing their savior's figure. It was actually a giant Philolial. The Philolial would turn to Naofumi and transform into their human form. Naofumi would be confused now. Did this person have a transformation ability? Were they a Philolial who became a human? He wasn't exactly sure. Victoria would see Naofumi's visible confusion and explain to him how she was the current Philolial queen. There was a bit of hostility to her voice though, but it wasn't necessarily her straight up wanting to attack Naofumi. Rather, it was as if she was trying to suppress this hostility she had towards him. She would even acknowledge Naofumi as one of the cardinal heroes. She would mention her desire here, that being for Naofumi to actually get along with the rest of the heroes and work together despite their prior issues. They needed to conquer the waves after all. If Naofumi failed to do so, well, simply put, she would just be forced to kill him and, well, the rest of the heroes. That way, well, they could summon more capable heroes in the future. In Naofumi's case, he wasn't even supposed to be summoned here. The shield hero was supposed to come in his place. Naofumi would also be made aware of the fact that, well, the waves, they were happening in other countries as well. This would especially surprise Naofumi, but he supposed it made sense. Naofumi would question why there was hostility in her voice though, in which she would mention how she was still a Philolial at the end of the day, and Philolials, they have a natural aggression towards dragons. Naofumi was no exception. Dragons were also rather aggressive towards Velolios, but in this category, Naofumi did seem to be an exception. Victoria assumed that the reason for this was because he came from another world, so not everything applied to him. Before leaving, Naofumi would get a sample of the dragon Rexo, assimilating it into his gem to add more power to his arsenal later. Naofumi, Raptalia, and Rhaegal would be teleported over to where the closest hero was afterwards. Unfortunately, that hero was Motoyasu. Motoyasu's eyes were narrow, seeing Naofumi appear before him. He would claim that Naofumi was the reason Ren and Itsuki died. Naofumi was confused though. He explained that he was nowhere near the other heroes. He hadn't even seen the other heroes for a good while now. But Motoyasu, he would not be listening right now. He wasn't having any of it. His anger and envy consumed him. Naofumi would grab Motoyasu's arms before headbutting him and kicking him away when Motoyasu tried to attack him. At this moment, the two heroes they would actually be targeted by another attack. This attack came from the Pope, surprisingly enough, the one who led the three heroes' church. He would claim that both Naofumi and Motoyasu were fake heroes. Rhaegal would swoop in though, trying to attack the Pope. The Pope would smack the dragon away. Naofumi would be right behind him though, with his battle aura flared up. He would try and throw a right hook at the Pope, but they would block his attack, and Naofumi would breathe poison at the Pope though. They weren't expecting this sort of attack from Naofumi, and they would end up coughing from the poison. They were beginning to get weaker as time progressed. Motoyasu would despise his current predicament, that being him having to cooperate with Naofumi, but he would do so nonetheless if it meant his own survival. He would charge at the Pope, and in the hopes of, being able to strike him, but the Pope would try to mimic Motoyasu's attacks, only to get sucker punched by Naofumi right after. The Pope would try to impale Naofumi, but he would get his face clawed at instead. Motoyasu would swing his spear at the Pope as well. Naofumi would burn the Pope's body right after. His skin would be boiling as he screamed in agony. Motoyasu would plunge his spear through the Pope's height though, killing him. Queen Morelia would show up with the other two heroes afterwards, confirming that they were actually alive. Motoyasu would comment on how he believed that they were dead though, in which it turned out that wasn't the case. The church apparently did try to kill Ren and Itsuki, but they were unsuccessful, and the queen's shadows were able to help them out of a pinch. The Pope's former followers would be arrested afterwards, but surprisingly enough, so would mine actually. Motoyasu would question why though, only for the queen to explain that her daughter, she had done several heinous actions, several heinous things while she was away, both mine and Old Cray actually, and they would be taken to trial. Slave mics would be placed on mine and Old Cray, in which they would be forced to tell the absolute truth, and of course nothing but the truth, about everything they did. Motoyasu would be distraught, finding out that he was being manipulated by mine this whole time. Naofumi, considering how he had been the most affected out of all the heroes due to the king and mine's actions, would be the one to decide what happened to the two next. Naofumi he would not hesitate in the slightest to kill the king. He would make sure he was beheaded. As far as mine went though, he saw her as unfit to even be allowed to leave the kingdom. Her punishment would be to live as a peasant, forced to do menial labor for the rest of her life. Well, that was at least what Naofumi originally thought, but then he decided no, have her be a peasant, but exiled from this kingdom. that was what mine would be forced to do. She would have to wander throughout the rest of the kingdoms as a peasant of the sword, so just working off of ends meet. And that ends meet was what she made, no one else. She was not allowed to join any parties. She would have to fend for herself completely moving forward. That was a punishment. Honestly, kinda light in comparison to Old Cray though. Naofumi's party, they would get their class upgrades afterwards, with the Pope and his followers no longer being an issue. That and the king, of course. The religion of the three heroes would have actually been disbanded at this point, replaced with a new religion which worshipped the four heroes equally. In Naofumi's case, he was actually seen as a replacement for the shield hero, so he would receive his praise as well. The queen would eventually request the presence of the four heroes in order to inform them all of an event happening on Kalmyra Island, and would supposedly boost their experience gain. The four heroes would be interested from this prospect. When first arriving on the island, Naofumi would meet up with a pair of people who he assumed, well, were adventurers. They seem to be rather distant though. Naofumi could practically smell the malicious intent that they held. Was this malicious intent targeted towards Naofumi though? Well, it sure felt like it. He found that those two were rather odd. He would focus his attention on grinding for experience points from the very first day though, not letting them really bother him. And he would hunt down several monsters. He wouldn't rest throughout the day at all. He would continue grinding for points until the next day, when Raftalia decided to make a comment on how they weren't really gaining much experience points like they were when they just came to the island, which was literally just yesterday. Naofumi would look at his status points and realize Raftalia, she had a point. Naofumi wouldn't really know what to do now. Raftalia would offer that they spend maybe the rest of their time on Kalmyra as a vacation of the swords. Naofumi would shrug and he would decide to go along with her suggestion. Regal would also appear to be rather pleased by this suggestion. This did not necessarily mean that Naofumi would stop hunting though. He would simply go swimming, searching for a fish to cook, which was a lighter form of hunting than what he was used to at this point. So, it was technically a vacation on the switch for Naofumi. But while swimming though, Naofumi would come across something shocking. It would be an underwater dragon hourglass. He would immediately swim up to the surface and call for Regal. He would hop onto their back and soar over to where Queen Morelia was. He had to tell her his findings. Another wave was going to be happening and they had 48 hours to prepare. The Queen would gather all of her forces in preparation for this event. Naofumi would practice some more with his new abilities until the day of the wave. The day the wave occurred, Naofumi would not hesitate to dice many of the monsters. He would fly on Regal's back to perform aerial attacks. Raftalia, she would have little to no issue with most of the monsters. When Naofumi was preparing to kill a boss though, the two unusual adventurers he encountered from his first day on the island, they would strike it, which would honestly impress Naofumi. The way that they were just able to strike and kill it within an instance. He was not expecting for them to be so strong. He wondered which party they came from, or if they were even part of any of the other four heroes' parties. He was curious to find out just what sort of training method they did. but he would be even more surprised when they pointed their weapons at him. Naofumi would question the reason for this. They would reveal at this moment that they were actually allied with Glass, and Naofumi, he was the one to kill her. Naofumi's eyes would widen when he heard this. He would understand immediately that these two were from a different world. He supposed that the one with the scythe and the girl who had gem abilities were their world's equivalent to the 4 cardinal heroes. If they were planning on killing him and the other heroes off to save their own world, well, so be it. Naofumi would just have to kill them first to ensure the safety of the world that he was living in now. Naofumi would just take on the two. Therese would try to use magical attacks in order to harm Naofumi, but he would activate his Dragon Gate to absorb her magic. He would go on to disrupt her magic right after and paralyze her with his voice magic. Naofumi would grab Like's right arm before bending it in the wrong direction. Like would scream in pain, but Naofumi, he would he would breathe poison in his face, causing Like to cough. And multiple times. He would be coughing continuously. He was feeling incredibly ill all of a sudden. Naofumi would headbutt Like before breathing fire in his face, burning it. Like would have lost his vision at this moment and begin to swing wildly. He would manage to land one attack on Naofumi though, which would surprise the Dragon Boy. He had his battle aura at its highest point right now, and Like wasn't on Naofumi's level either. Naofumi was about 12 levels ahead of Like. Did it have something to do with his weapon then? There was a possibility that Like's scythe allowed him to bypass the defenses of his enemies, but that was just a hypothesis, that was just a theory. And if that were the case, well, it would be best to get rid of Like immediately then. So he would crush the man's lungs before dislocating his shoulder. Right when Naofumi was about to finish off Like though, he would find that Motoyasu would be the one to beat him to the chase, striking the man's height before he could even have the chance to do so. Motoyasu's eyes were glowing red at this moment, and he had a red aura around him. He would actually stab through Teresa's head right after. Naofumi would be impressed, but his face would soon form a frown when Motoyasu aimed his weapon at him now. Motoyasu, he would declare that they will be settling their fight right here and now. Naofumi didn't know what Motoyasu was getting on about until he brought up what was supposed to be a duel back at the capital. Naofumi would facepalm until Motoyasu threw a spear at him. Naofumi would dodge though. Motoyasu would get close to Naofumi right after, hoping to slice off his head with his spear. Naofumi noticed that the tip of the spear looked rather unusual. It looked like I don't even know how I could describe this on YouTube. It looked like a toy, you could say, but not for children, you could say, essentially. That this would actually distract Naofumi, which would allow for him to manage to cut Naofumi's cheek. Naofumi would realize that he had to restrain Motoyasu now. He couldn't go light on the blonde either. He would grab Motoyasu's wrist before twisting it in the other direction, the other way. Motoyasu would roar in pain but try to keep his focus on killing Naofumi. Motoyasu saw how easily Naofumi dealt with Glass, how easily Naofumi was able to defeat himself. Now here he was, upstaging Motoyasu once again by single-handedly fighting Glass's allies. Motoyasu refused to allow Naofumi to get all the thunder once again. He envied his power. He wanted to be like Naofumi in a way, and he hated himself for that. all of these emotions were just bubbling up in Amoteyasu up until now. Finally, they were being released, and all in one full storm. If he couldn't have Naofumi's strength, then the next best thing was to kill him. Naofumi would continue to dodge a series of attacks from Amoteyasu. Although some of the attacks, they weren't simple thrusts, but rather laser beams shooting out from the spear. They would actually emit huge explosions as well, which disoriented Naofumi a bit. Naofumi would be forced to bob and weave against the oncoming attacks from Amoteyasu, who would try to use this disorientation from the explosions against him. Naofumi would eventually grab Amoteyasu's face though, and slam it into the ground. He would use his voice magic to paralyze Amoteyasu, but it didn't seem to have an effect on him. He figured that this could be due to his status as one of the legendary heroes of this world. Naofumi would click his tongue in annoyance. He would end up knocking the blonde unconscious though from his own onslaught of attacks. When he got back up, Amoteyasu would have fallen unconscious from the pain and return to normal, albeit with a reduction in his stats the day after. He was also being held in confinement for attacking a fellow hero until further notice. The queen would force Amoteyasu to think about his questionable decisions, his questionable actions from yesterday. But all this really did though was enrage him even more. Amoteyasu could feel a dark power beginning to flow to his fingertips. He would vow vengeance against Naofumi if it was the last thing he did. And that is how I end this series, Titan Clan. So yeah, you guys already know the deal. If you like the video, if you like this movie, you guys should definitely hit that subscribe button, especially if you've been rocking with my content for a good while now. You should definitely like the video, leave a comment, because comments and likes help the algorithm, and maybe share the video as well to other people who may be interested in this sort of content. But beyond that, I have nothing else to say. Titan Clan, it is your boy KingTitanX signing out. Peace.